Ever hear a whisper in the dark and think, that's a tomorrow problem? Welcome to Not My Ghost, Not My Problem, where hosts Jen and Kelly share listener-submitted ghost stories, haunted places, and chilling mysteries, all with a wicked sense of humor. It's spooky, it's hilarious, and it might just make you second-guess that shadow in the corner. Believer or skeptic, there's always room around their campfire. Search for Not My Ghost, Not My Problem on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. Hit play, and remember, it's only your problem if you acknowledge it.
Research and recording of Canadian creepies happens on the shared land and traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. A key treaty governing this territory is the Dish with One Spoon Agreement. This treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee people binds them to share and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, settlers, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. We all share the responsibility of ensuring the dish is never empty, meaning we must take care of the land and the creatures we share it with.
Welcome, wanderers, to journey down the crooked path, a place where the stories are stranger, the shadows stretch longer, and the things that go bump in the night might just be listening. I'm Amanda Joy, your guide into the eerie, the forgotten, and the downright bizarre. Here, we step off the well-lit roads of Canadian creepies and venture into the murky corners of history, folklore, and the unexplained, where the whispers grow louder and the truth is never quite what it seems. So let's take a deep breath, watch your step, and whatever you do, don't look back. Once you start down the crooked path, you never know what might follow.
Since its birth, the Canadian landscape and its people have been influenced by several ideas that lean a bit more towards the paranormal side of things. We had a prime minister who was obsessed with the occult and spiritualism. William Lyon Mackenzie King would often consult with psychics and mediums, holding seances to communicate with his deceased mother, his beloved dogs, as well as gather political advice from advisors from beyond the grave. Between 1913 and 1922, King had suffered some major personal losses, losing his mother, father, brother, and sister. The loss of his mother sent him somewhat over the edge, and he had been a longtime bachelor, so the silence around him led him towards spiritualism. This is the belief that had become popular in the late 1800s, that there is, in fact, life after death, and that we are capable of speaking with lost loved ones after they pass. He used spiritualism as a tool to keep speaking with his family after their passing. As such, he had a network of mediums that he would consult with. At his home in Ottawa, the Laurier House, and his country estate, he kept occult objects and kept up with his practice, from crystal balls to table rapping and automatic writing. On occasion, he would even hold seances with his Minister of National Defence, Norman Rogers, and also discuss his spirit messages with the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. Then, in the 1980s, a Canadian psychiatrist named Dr. Lawrence Pastor and his patient, Michelle Smith, later turned wife, published a book titled Michelle Remembers. According to the book, Pastor had used a recovery memory therapy, a method that was highly controversial and now debunked, to unlock some of Michelle's memories from the 1950s. During these supposed therapy sessions, she recalled a group of underground devil worshippers that had kidnapped her and forced her into blood rituals, and that she had seen Satan appear himself before her very eyes. Of course, this book became a massive international bestseller, and Pastor traveled around the world presenting his findings as medical facts. The book and his work sort of became a blueprint for satanic ritual abuse, which, as it would turn out, was a myth. But at the time, the whole Western society was gripped by fear, or a satanic panic that would last for the next 15 years. As a result, anything that was a counterculture was basically accused of having ties to devil worship. Heavy metal, Dungeons & Dragons, horror movies were all openly and heavily targeted by Canadian school boards and parents alike, claiming that these were all gateways to the occult. Leading into the Martinsville witch hunt over in Saskatchewan. During a routine child abuse investigation, social workers and aggressive interrogators used leading questions and psychological pressure to get young children to tell wild and impossible stories, claiming that their daycare workers and even local police officers were all a part of a secret cult that kept children in cages, stuffed them into freezers, performed animal sacrifices, and forced the children to drink blood. All this led to some pretty wild panic, and 9 people faced 180 criminal charges, destroying lives and families overnight. Then, FBI agent Keith Lanning revealed, after looking at thousands of cases that came across North America, that there was zero evidence that such a cult or organization had ever existed in Canada. After this, there were some people left with some pretty embarrassing egg on their faces. For some bizarre reason, and without any supporting evidence, Canadian history has been dotted with hysteria about the occult. So what do you think happened when the Canadian government started printing money with what looked like the devil's face on it? Here's how it went down. Canada was still shaking off its post-war jitters, and more recently, Prime Minister Mackenzie King's occult hobbies had come to light, when suddenly, on February 6, 1952, King George IV passed away peacefully in his home from a coronary thrombosis, which is basically a blood clot that develops inside the coronary artery. Overnight, while the country mourned, the heads of state were shifting from their ailing wartime patriarch to his 25-year-old daughter. The young and glamorous Princess Elizabeth would ascend to the throne as Queen Elizabeth II, sparking a global wave of optimism known as the New Elizabeth Age. With this transition, the Bank of Canada decided to commemorate this new era by redesigning the nation's cash. Since 1937, Canadian money had featured King George IV. Now the bank wanted the new 1954 Canadian Landscape series to represent a fresh start for a modernizing country. This was the third series of legal tender in Canada's history and completely revolutionized how Canadians interacted with their money. See, at the time, Canadian money looked very much like the classic British colonial currency, with its heavy Victorian borders and mythological figures like Zeus. The idea was to make the money look distinctly Canadian, modern, and clean. For the first time, the portrait of the matriarch was pushed to the right side of the bill, with the idea that when the bill would be folded in half in the wallet, the Queen's face would be creased down the middle. For this new series, all of the allegory figures were completely abolished. Prior to this change, for example, the $1 bill displayed agriculture with tools, horns, and wheat. The 100 represented commerce and industry, with male figures set against factories and ships. The late $2 bill, rest in peace, represented transportation with the Roman god Mercury. The new shift replaced this sort of imagery with sweeping, realistic, and tranquil scenes from the Canadian wilderness. The $1 bill now depicted a landscape of logs flowing down a river to highlight the Canadians' massive forestry industry. The $2 bill featured a peaceful rural scene of Richmond, a town in the eastern township of South Quebec. The 50, a beach and ocean scene at Lockport, Nova Scotia. And the 100, a dry rolling wilderness landscape overlooking Kamloops Lake in British Columbia. The likeness of the Queen used for the money was a portrait taken by Armenian-Canadian photographer Yosef Karsh. He had gone to England in 1951 to photograph the royal family. At the time, Princess Elizabeth, alongside Prince Philip, were photographed at their home, the Clarence House, with their children, young Prince Charles and Princess Anne. The portrait bust of Elizabeth was originally used on the Canadian 2-cent stamp. In the photograph, she is wearing an off-the-shoulder gown and a delicate diamond tiara. And while this has nothing to do with devil heads, demonic depictions, or anything we've discussed so far in this episode, I do want to note that Yosef's brother was also a photographer, Malek. He was famous for capturing the Ottawa's tulips, but he took a photograph of Parliament Hill that was used for the back of the $1 bill in this new series. So, we have two immigrant photographer brothers who fled the Armenian genocide, found home in Canada, and both of them have their artwork on opposite sides of the nation's primary currency, which is pretty freaking cool if you ask me.
You. Yeah, you. Still haunting the same old fast fashion? Time to dig up something better with Back from the Dead Goods, a Canadian small business where forgotten threads get a second life and sustainability meets spooky. This isn't just upcycled clothing, it's resurrected fashion with an eerie edge. Handpicked, reworked, and revived, every piece is as unique as a ghost story whispered at midnight. And because you're a part of the Canadian Creepies family, you get an exclusive deal. Use code Canadian Creepies at checkout for 10% off. Find them lurking on Instagram, Etsy, and Poshmark. Links are in the episode description. Give your wardrobe a second chance at life, if you dare. Looking for your next obsession? The Creators Collective Podcasts is your gateway to the dark, the chilling, and the downright fascinating. We're a community of independent podcasts with one goal: to share the best in true crime, paranormal tales, folklore, and unexplained mysteries. Whether you crave cold cases that won't stay closed, haunted histories that refuse to be forgotten, or stories that make you sleep with the lights on, there's a show waiting for you in the collective. And when you join us, you're not just listening to one podcast, you're stepping into a world of creators who love this stuff as much as you do. Check out the Creators Collective today. Follow the link in our show notes to discover your next favorite podcast. We'll be waiting for you. Let's take a moment during this break to talk about something that matters. Something that doesn't get to be background noise. The Anishinaabe-Moan word, Nikinagana, means we are all related, and we are. But relationship isn't just about words, it's about responsibility. Canadian author Naomi Klein once said, "It is not enough to say that we live on Indigenous land. We have to act as if we do." And one way to do that is by supporting Pay Your Rent, a grassroots mutual aid initiative that offers direct material support to Indigenous organizers across this land. It's not charity, it's rent. For those of us who aren't Indigenous to this place, it's a way to show up differently, to redistribute some of what's been taken. The Pay Your Rent Fund started as a one-time request for help in 2018 and grew into a nonprofit called Nikinagana. Your monthly or one-time donation can help provide food, hygiene supplies, housing support, and resources for Indigenous-led resistance and community care. So if you've ever said, "We're all related," ask yourself, are you being a good relative? Visit payyourrent.ca and find out more about how you can be part of something better. Now, back to this case.
Now, because the original image of the Queen had been circulating on the stamp, the government wanted to make sure that the citizens didn't confuse the new banknotes with the existing stamps. So the Bank of Canada ordered a considerable visual change to the image. They hired a Toronto graphic arts firm named Bridgens Limited to completely retouch the photographic negatives all by hand. Their artist manually removed the diamond tiara from her head and drew artificial hair back into the empty space. They also flipped the image so that her face was left instead of right. Master engraver George Gunderson took this modified photograph and meticulously cut it into steel plates for printing. By 1956, these new banknotes had been passing through the hands of Canadians for about 2 years before the media caught wind of any story. By then, a few citizens had pointed out a somewhat unsettling detail about the Queen's portrait on those new fancy bills. And with this creepy observation, it was a full-on media frenzy. Front-page headlines started to appear across the country. Prominent newspapers like the Calgary Herald, the Saskatoon Star-Phoenix, and the Regina Leader-Post all started running stories with these breathless titles, warning the public about a sinister presence or questioning if there was satanic sabotage inside of the National Treasury. You see, right behind the Queen's ear, there appeared a devil's face. The heavy stylized curls behind her ear formed a very menacing face. Two dark and jagged tufts of her hair at the top of this cluster looked like a pair of furious, furrowed eyebrows. Below those brows, there was a small pocket of shadows that created the illusion of a very deep set of hollow eyes. Next, a sharp and skeletal-looking nose was created from an unprinted highlights that ran down the center of the hair bundle. The mouth appeared in a dark crescent of ink that sat right below the nose, and it was also very noticeable that it looked like a mocking, grinning smile. And finally, one of the bottom curls formed into a sharp point, giving it a classic devil-shaped look chin, all sitting there right at the back of the Queen's head. One report from the Toronto Star, a reporter stated that the devil's face could be seen leering from the Queen's curls on Canadian banknotes. And this outcry wasn't just inside the Canadian borders. A British politician and alderman from Hartlepool wrote a complaint about the image. Mr. H.L. Hogg wrote letters to Norman Robertson, who was the High Commissioner for Canada in the United Kingdom, which is the equivalent of the Canadian ambassador. He believed that this was not some sort of optical illusion. No, this was a meticulous act of treason and sabotage, calling it a fiendish design, and also called for all of the banknotes to be destroyed, which these were in every single denomination. The Canadian Bank wanted a uniformed look for this new era, so they used the exact same engraved steel master portrait of Queen Elizabeth II for the entire print run, which meant that Canadians were walking around with a wallet full of devil faces. Now, the thing is, this was post-war time, and during such, there happened to be a huge religious boom. Plus, the people were starting to have Cold War anxieties. Prime Minister Mackenzie King had also passed, leaving behind his journals in which he recalled every single seance and mediumship encounter that he had. So the Canadian public was already highly sensitive to anything that could possibly be connected to the occult, especially when it came to their government. So the Canadian people started to believe a few things were going on here, but for sure, this was no simple mistake. The rumor mill created some pretty wild conspiracy theories. One was that the printer was an occultist. This was the primary theory. The British American Banknote Company had accidentally hired a post-war European immigrant who was secretly an occultist. Post-war, many families were looking for a fresh start. However, a very paranoid Canadian public looked at these new arrivals with suspicion, and so many Canadians believed that the printer had used advanced European training to bypass Canadian security screeners and had used calculated geometric angles of the Queen's curls so that the face would only become visible once the bills hit people's pockets. The European occult idea arose because just a few years earlier, the infamous British occultist Aleister Crowley had died. He had self-proclaimed himself the Great Beast 666. If an occultist was involved with the devil head, then it must surely be some sort of black magic ritual, right? With millions of Canadians continuously participating in a daily exchange of dark energy, cursing all the good Christian souls within Canada. Now, it was kind of hard for the Canadian government to kill this rumor because it was a well-known tradition in printing practice that master engravers often hid miniature personal symbols, initials, or micro-signatures within the complex geometric lines of banknotes. The government also hadn't publicly released the name of who the printer was, so the public took that as an indication that the government was deliberately hiding the identity of a captured occultist saboteur. Another idea was that the IRA, or the Irish Republic, was behind the devil head. An anti-monarchist Irish nationalist must have successfully infiltrated the Canadian banknote printing process. The goal? To commit a high-profile and offensive act of psychological warfare against the crown. The grinning devil was an insult to the global British Commonwealth. Okay, so to be fair, the 1950s were the beginning of the IRA's border campaigns, where they were actively launching raids, bombings, and sabotage campaigns against the British infrastructure. And newspapers were filling the headlines about militant Irish resistance fighting against the British rule, which meant, again, there must have been some sort of inside job committed by the master printer. A more politically explosive theory was that this was the work of a French-Canadian separatist, which again pointed towards the printer, who must have been deeply hostile towards the British Crown. And this person had infiltrated the production line at one point in the Ottawa printing security firm. It really sounds like the people didn't trust their government to be as secure as you would expect a government to be. In the 1950s, there was a simmering cultural and political tension in Quebec. There was a lot of anti-monarchy sentiments happening where the French-Canadian nationalists didn't see the British Crown as a symbol of stability. Instead, and kind of rightfully so, to them the crown was a symbol of historical conquest, assimilation, and colonial oppression. There were several underground nationalist groups that were forming, so to the Canadian people, the idea of a radical sovereignist artist using their craft to try and humiliate the federal government on a national stage wasn't so far-fetched. In truth, none of these were correct. George Gunderson was not a shadowy, radical political infiltrator. He was not an immigrant occultist. He was a highly respected and very traditional master craftsman who served as the art director for the British American Banknote Company. When he heard these rumors, he was rightfully devastated. He had not intentionally created a hidden devil's head in the Queen's hair. So how did it get there? A few things happened. The photographer Crush was known for his high contrast work, which created deep ink black shadows and stark white highlights. Then Gunderson was tasked to hand etch the photo into master steel. A photo which had been altered to remove the Queen's crown and replace it with more hair. Now, Gunderson was a perfectionist, and he painstakingly copied thousands of microscopic lines onto the steel plate, meaning he copied it as precisely as possible. All of those deep shadows and the bright highlights in every single strand or curl in her hair. Now, when printing on currency, those perfectly reproduced highlights and shadowed lines interacted in a very specific way behind the Queen's left ear. In short, the devil's head was the illusion of two-part accident. The Toronto artist's new hair template, and Gunderson engraved it so precisely, deep shadows, highlights, and all, that they created what looked like a dynamic illusion. You see, the brain is hardwired to look for faces in random places, especially in abstract patterns, like hair strands and curls. This trait has developed over thousands of years so that infants could instantly recognize their mothers, and so that hunters could spot hidden predators in the woods. Think of it as the same way a person can look up at clouds or heck, even grill marks on a sandwich and see Jesus. The brain forces confusing lines to take the form of faces. Mix this with a super paranoid population, and you get a collective idea that there is a purposefully placed devil's head hidden in their money. Now, obviously, the Canadian government could not continue to distribute money with a devil face peeking out of the Queen's hair. But they also couldn't just reach into Canadian wallets and remove the money either. So instead, they hired another brilliant engraver, a French-Canadian named Yves Barrel, to create a new engraved plate in which he gave the Queen a new haircut. But he didn't redesign the portrait from scratch. He just focused on the devil face cluster of hair. By deepening the grooves on the steel, he was able to ensure that the areas in the grin and the sharp nose would hold more ink when pressed onto paper, and the face was seamlessly removed. Once altered plates were ready, the printing press over in Ottawa switched them and were able to start printing devil headless bills. Now, the government didn't request for any of the original bills to be returned, but instead relied on the natural lifestyle of cash. By late 1956 into early 1957, the new bills took over the Canadian economy, and the satanic panic slowly faded. Until the 80s, that is. The devil's head bills were only printed for a short period of time, between 1954 and 1956, and since the government never recalled the money, it's still considered legal tender, meaning that any note left in, say, a family vault or a grandparent's cash stash can be used for purchases, but it's also a small gold mine as well. Meaning, if you come across one of these bills that looks like it was printed yesterday, well, collectors will pay a pretty price for it, anywhere between $500 to $5,000, but it has to be a pristine bill. Higher denominations are more rare, as the $1 and the $2 bills were super common at the time. So if you find one Our $2 bill and it's old, creased, torn from being passed around, well, it loses a lot of its value. Collectors will still buy these, but it's more likely you'll only get maybe $30 for it. The rare and elusive $1,000 devil's headed queen bill can go for upwards to $8,000 from collectors. How do you know if you have one in your possession? Well, the crows to the left of the queen's ears have sharp, bright, unprinted white highlights that clearly form a hooked nose and angry eyebrows. It can be pretty easy to spot. The modified note has the exact same pitch of hair, but it's noticeably darker and heavier shaded, with thick black lines and inks. It looks completely uniform. So tonight, before you turn off the lights, do a little digging. Ask your parents or your grandparents if they kept any old cash tucked away in an attic box, a family scrapbook, or an old safe. If you find a crisp, uncreased bill from 1954, don't look at the serial number first. Take it to a bright window, hold a flashlight up to the paper, and zoom in right behind the young queen's left ear. You may just have a small fortune on your hand, or who knows? Maybe it really is cursed cash. If you want more creepy clues, behind-the-scenes chaos, throwbacks, and hints about what's coming next, you can follow us at Canadian Creepies on Instagram. You can also follow Radio Valerie on TikTok and Instagram for extra details, bonus content, and little breadcrumbs that she'll drop before each episode. You can find me at Down the Crooked Path on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. You can also check out my World Mystery podcast of the same name if you want even more strange stories. I'll be back next week with another creepy chapter of Canadian history.